Minna pressed her hands against the escape pod window and screamed. The station fell away beneath her as the pod's engines fired, carrying her towards safety while the only person who had ever truly protected her remained behind to die through the thick glass. She could see the corridor where Ji-hoon stood. She could see the assassins approaching from both ends. 5 of them, at least, their weapons raised and ready. She could see Ji-hoon lift his borrowed gun with hands that shook from blood loss and exhaustion. And then the pod's rotation carried the window away from the station, and she could see nothing at all. Ji-hoon watched the pod disappear into the darkness of space and allowed himself one moment of relief. One moment to feel the weight lift from his shoulders. One moment to know that whatever happened next, he had succeeded. Then he turned to face the assassins. The child has escaped, one of them said into a communicator. The human remains. Kill him and pursue the pod. Came the reply. Ji-hoon smiled. You are welcome to try, he said. He did not try to win. He knew that was impossible. Instead, he fought to delay. He collapsed. The first section of corridor with a carefully placed shot to the structural supports, forcing the assassins to climb through debris to reach him. He triggered the fire suppression system in the second section, filling the air with dense foam that blinded his enemies and bought him precious seconds. He retreated through the pod bay, destroying consoles and overloading systems, turning every step into an obstacle course that slowed his pursuers down. The assassins caught up to him eventually. They always would have. The first blade took him in the shoulder, spinning him round. The second opened a gash across his thigh that dropped him to one knee. But even as he fell, Ji-hoon kept fighting. He grabbed the leg of the nearest assassin and pulled, bringing the warrior down with him. He drove his knife into the gap between armor plates and felt the body go limp. Another assassin kicked him in the ribs, and something cracked deep inside his chest. Ji-hoon rolled with the impact and came up with a piece of broken metal in his hand, driving it into the assassin's throat before the warrior could react. 3 down, 2 remaining, but Ji-hoon could barely see now. His body was failing, systems shutting down one by one as blood loss and trauma took their toll. He managed to wound the 4th assassin badly enough that the warrior could not pursue, but the 5th caught him from behind. The blade went through his chest. Ji-hoon looked down at the metal protruding from his body with something like surprise. Stubborn creature, the assassin said, twisting the blade. Why did you fight so hard for a child that was not even yours? Ji-hoon's lips moved, but no sound came out. He fell forward as the assassin withdrew the blade, landing face down on the cold metal floor of the pod bay. His blood spread in a dark pool around him. His eyes closed, and the assassin turned to pursue the escape pod, confident that the human was finally dead. But Ji-hoon was not dead. Not yet. Somewhere deep inside his failing body, something refused to stop. His heart stuttered and then kept beating. His lungs dragged in one more breath, then another, and his hand, trembling with the last of his strength, closed around the weapon he had dropped when he fell. Yeonsu fought like a goddess of war. The assassination attempt had failed to capture her, though it had cost the lives of nearly half her personal guard. Now she led the survivors through the station, cutting down traitors and varaks alike, her ancient blade singing through the air as she carved a path toward the escape pod bay. She had received Minna's emergency beacon. She knew her daughter was safe, but she also knew that Ji-hoon had not been in that pod when she finally reached the bay. She found a scene of carnage. 5 assassins lay dead or dying, brought down by a single human who should have been dead himself a dozen times over. And in the center of it all, Ji-hoon lay in a pool of his own blood, his body broken in 17 places. His heart barely beating, but his eyes were open, and when he saw Yeonsu, he smiled. She is safe, he whispered. I kept my promise. Then his eyes closed, and his heart finally stopped. The medical teams worked for 6 hours to bring him back. They rebuilt his shattered bones with synthetic replacements. They regenerated the tissue that had been burned and torn and pierced. They restarted his heart 3 times when it tried to give up, and through it all, Mina refused to leave his bedside. She held his hand and talked to him, telling him stories about clever rabbits and loyal dogs, about ordinary people who became heroes through courage rather than strength. She told him about the leader she was going to become, the changes she was going to make, the galaxy she was going to build where no one would ever have to sacrifice themselves for others. She told him to wake up, because she was not finished learning from him yet. 3 weeks later, Ji-hoon opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was Mina's face, tear-streaked and exhausted, but radiating joy. The second thing he saw was Yeon-su, standing by the window with her hands clasped behind her back, looking out at the stars. Admiral Taekwon is dead, Yeon-su said without turning around. His entire faction has been destroyed. The Vareks have retreated to their own space, and I have made it very clear what will happen if they ever threaten my family again. She turned to face him, and there were tears in her ancient silver eyes. You were supposed to die, she continued, her voice breaking slightly. The doctor said it was impossible. No one survives injuries like yours. No one. I made a promise, Ji-hoon said, his voice rough from disuse. I could not break it. Yeon-su moved to his bedside and took his other hand in hers. Do you understand now? She asked. Do you understand why I chose you? Ji-hoon looked at her, then at Mina, then back at the matriarch. I think so, he said slowly. But tell me anyway. Yeon-su smiled through her tears. You were never guarding me, she said. You were never even guarding my daughter. Not really. You were guarding my hope, my belief that the universe still contains people worth trusting, people who will do the right thing simply because it is right, without calculating the cost or expecting a reward. She squeezed his hand gently. That is my most precious treasure. She continued. That is what I was afraid to lose, and you protected it. Again and again you protected it. So I picked you, Park Ji-hoon. And I will keep picking you for as long as you let me. Ji-hoon felt tears prick at his own eyes. Something he had not experienced in longer than he could remember. I will let you, he said softly. I will always let you. Mina threw her arms around him, careful of his healing wounds, and held on like she would never let go. Yeon-su placed her hand on his head in a blessing as old as her. Civilization, and for the first time in 20 years, Park Ji-hoon felt like he had finally come home. Outside the window, the stars burned on, eternal and unchanging. But inside that small room, something new had been born, something that would change the galaxy forever. A family, forged not by blood, but by choice, a bond that no force in the universe could ever break, and a human who had proven, once and for all, that true guardianship had nothing to do with strength. It was about love. It had always been about love. The diplomatic station hung at the edge of neutral space, a massive wheel of metal and glass that rotated slowly against the backdrop of an ancient nebula. Representatives from 7 major powers had gathered here to negotiate a new trade agreement, and High Matriarch Yeon-su's presence was essential to the proceedings. Ji-hoon had argued against bringing Mina. He had stood before the council and laid out every concern, every vulnerability, every way that enemies could exploit the presence of the matriarch's only heir at such a public event. Admiral Taekwon had laughed in his face. The human sees assassins in every shadow, Taekwon said with a dismissive wave. Perhaps if he had real military experience instead of playing nursemaid, he would understand that showing strength requires showing stability. The princes must attend. Yeon-su had listened to both arguments and then made her decision. Protocol demands that Mina accompany me, she told Ji-hoon privately. If I leave her behind, it will be seen as a sign of weakness. Our enemies will think I am afraid. With respect, Matriarch, you should be afraid, Ji-hoon replied. Something about this summit feels wrong. I cannot explain it. But every instinct I have is screaming, that we are walking into a trap. Yansu studied him for a long moment. I trust your instincts, she said. But I also trust that you will be there to protect her if your instincts prove correct. That is why you are coming with us. The summit began well enough. Diplomats made speeches, agreements were drafted, and revised. Mina sat beside her mother in the Grand Assembly Hall, bored but behaving, occasionally catching Ji-hoon's eye and making faces that made him struggle not to smile. He stood at the edge of the chamber, watching everything, cataloging every exit and every face and every movement that seemed out of place. There were too many guards from Admiral Taekwon's personal fleet. They had positioned themselves at key points throughout the station, supposedly for additional security, but their positions did not make sense for protection. They made perfect sense for an ambush. Ji-hoon's hand drifted toward his communication device, ready to call for an evacuation. Then the lights went out. Emergency lighting flickered on a moment later, casting everything in dim red shadows. And through the chaos of confused diplomats and shouting officials, Ji-hoon saw Admiral Taekwon smile. The doors to the assembly hall burst open and warriors poured through. But they were not Volanti. They wore the black armor of the Varax Collective, an enemy power that had been seeking Volanti territory for centuries. Taekwon had made an alliance with the enemy. Taekwon had betrayed everything he had sworn to protect. Secure the matriarch, one of the Varax commanders shouted. Kill the heir. Ji-hoon did not wait to hear more. He grabbed Mina from her seat and ran, ignoring the sounds of combat erupting behind him, ignoring Yeonsu's shout of alarm, focusing only on getting the child away from the killing zone. Where are we going? Mina asked, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. Somewhere safe, Ji-hoon promised, though he had no idea if such a place existed on this station. The main corridors were compromised. Taekwon's people had control of the security systems, which meant they could track movement through the official passages. So Ji-hoon went where no respectable warrior would think to look. He found a maintenance hatch and pulled Mina through, dropping into a narrow service tunnel that smelled of recycled air and machine oil. They crawled through darkness, guided only by the emergency lights that flickered at irregular intervals behind them. Ji-hoon could hear the sounds of pursuit, boots on metal, shouted orders, the whine of weapons charging. He pushed Mina ahead of him and kept moving, taking turns at random, trying to put as much distance as possible between them and their hunters. They emerged in a garbage processing area. Ji-hoon boosted Mina into a waste chute and followed her down, sliding through darkness until they tumbled out into a recycling center on the station's lower level. This way, he whispered, taking her hand and leading her through the maze of sorting machines and compressed waste blocks. A door opened ahead of them and an assassin stepped through. Weapon raised, Ji-hoon shoved Mina behind a sorting machine and charged. He had no weapon, no armor, nothing but his training and his desperation. But the assassin expected a panicked civilian, not a soldier who had survived 20 years of human warfare. Ji-hoon caught the weapon arm and twisted, feeling bones crack beneath his hands. He drove his elbow into the assassin's throat and felt cartilage give way. The assassin fell, choking, and Ji-hoon took his weapon and kept moving. 2 more assassins found them in the next corridor. Ji-hoon killed one with a shot to the head and wounded the second, but not before taking a blade across his ribs. Blood soaked through his uniform as he stumbled forward, one arm wrapped around his wounded side, the other hand still gripping Mina's fingers. You are hurt, she said, her voice small and frightened. I will be fine, he lied. Keep moving. They reached the escape pod bay after what felt like hours of running and hiding and fighting. Ji-hoon's vision was starting to blur from blood loss. His legs felt like they were made of lead, but they had made it. The bay was empty, except for a single escape pod, its hatch open and waiting. Ji-hoon looked at it, then looked at Mina, and felt his heart break. The pod was designed for emergency evacuation. It could hold one adult or one child. Not both. Get inside, he said, guiding her toward the hatch. What about you? Minna asked, her silver eyes wide with understanding. You are coming too. There is no room, Ji-hoon said gently. But you will be safe. The pod will take you to the rescue fleet. Your mother will find you. No, Minna grabbed his arm with both hands, her small fingers digging into his flesh. I will not leave you. Ji-hoon knelt down and looked into her eyes. Do you remember what I told you about courage? He asked. About doing something even when you are scared. Tears were streaming down Minna's face now. This is not fair, she whispered. No, Ji-hoon agreed. It is not, but some things are more important than being safe. And you are one of those things. You are going to grow up and become the greatest leader the hegemony has ever known. But you cannot do that if you die here today. He lifted her into the pod and pressed the launch sequence before she could protest. Tell your mother I kept my promise. He said. The hatch sealed, the pod launched, and Ji-hoon turned to face the corridor as the sounds of approaching enemies grew closer. He had one weapon with 3 shots remaining. He had wounds that would kill him within the hour, even if no one else touched him. He had absolutely no chance of surviving what was coming. But Minna was safe, and somehow that was enough. 3 months had passed since Ji-hoon woke to find himself named as the personal guardian of High Matriarch Yeon-soo. 3 months of struggle and doubt and constant grinding inadequacy. He stood now in the shadow of a marble pillar, watching a diplomatic reception unfold in the grand ballroom below, cataloging every face and every movement with the desperate attention of a man who knew he was outmatched. The other guards looked at him with barely hidden contempt. They were Volanti warriors, trained from childhood in combat arts that humans could barely comprehend. They stood 7 feet tall on average, their reflexes 3 times faster than any human could achieve, their bodies capable of feats that would kill an ordinary person. And then there was Ji-hoon, small and soft and impossibly fragile by comparison. Admiral Taekwon made no secret of his opinion. The decorated military commander had served the hegemony for 800 years, and he viewed Yeon-soo's choice as a personal insult to everything he had built. The human is a joke, Taekwon had said at a council meeting just last week, loud enough for Ji-hoon to hear from his post by the door. He makes us look weak before the entire galaxy. What message does it send when our matriarch hides behind a creature that could be killed by a strong wind? Ji-hoon had said nothing. He had simply filed the information away and continued his duties because he knew Taekwon was right about one thing. He could not compete with these warriors on their terms. So he had decided to compete on his own terms instead. Every night after his shift ended, Ji-hoon studied. He memorized the layout of every corridor in the palace, every maintenance tunnel, every service passage that the regular guards ignored. He learned the names and faces of every servant, every official, every visiting dignitary. He studied the history of Volanti assassination techniques, reading accounts of every attempt on a matriarch's life going back 10,000 years. He slept 4 hours a night at most. He ate when he remembered. He drove himself to the edge of collapse, because he knew that his mind was the only weapon he had. Young Minna did not understand any of this. All she knew was that the kind human who had saved her life was always around, always watching, always ready to answer her endless questions with patience and warmth. She followed him everywhere, much to the horror of her official tutors and attendants. Tell me another story, she would demand, tugging at his sleeve while he stood guard outside her mother's chambers, and Ji-hoon would smile and tell her tales of Earth, of clever rabbits who outsmarted tigers, of loyal dogs who traveled across continents to find their masters, of ordinary people who became heroes not through strength, but through courage and determination. Were you scared? I asked him one evening. When you saved me from the explosion. Ji-hoon considered the question carefully before answering. Yes, he admitted. I was very scared. Then why did you do it? Because being scared is not the same as being unable to act, he said, kneeling down to look her in the eyes. Fear tells us that something is dangerous. But courage is what we do after we feel the fear. I was scared, but I moved anyway. Because some things are more important than being safe. Mina thought about this for a long moment. I want to be like that, she said finally. I want to be brave like you. Ji-hoon felt something warm bloom in his chest. Something he had not felt in a very long time. You will be, he promised her. You will be even braver. A week later, Ji-hoon noticed something wrong. A servant named Haran had been assigned to bring afternoon tea to Mina's study room. Ji-hoon had memorized Haran's patterns over the past 3 months. The way she walked, the steadiness of her hands, the calm confidence in her eyes. Today, everything was different. Haran's hands trembled slightly as she carried the tea tray. Her eyes darted around the corridor. Never quite meeting anyone's gaze, her steps were faster than usual. As if she wanted to complete her task and escape as quickly as possible, Ji-hoon intercepted her outside Mina's door. Let me help you with that, he said pleasantly. Reaching for the tray, Haran pulled back, her eyes widening with something that looked very much like fear. No. I can manage. Please, just let me through. Ji-hoon did not move. I insist, he said. And there was steel beneath his gentle tone. He took the tray from her unresisting hands and lifted the lid of the teapot. The liquid inside was pale green. Exactly as it should be, but there was a faint shimmer beneath the surface. Barely visible unless you knew exactly what to look for. Ji-hoon had spent 3 sleepless nights studying Volanthi. Poisons. He knew what that shimmer meant. Who sent? You, he asked quietly. Haran crumpled, she fell to her knees, and confessed everything through her tears. The threats against her family. The instructions she had been given. The name of the official who had recruited her for this task. Ji-hoon listened to it all. Then called for the palace guards within an hour. The conspiracy had been unraveled. 3 officials and 2 guards were arrested. All of them connected to Admiral Taekwon's faction. The poison would have killed Meo within minutes. And no one would have known until it was far too late that evening. Yeonsu summoned Ji-hoon to her private chambers. She sat by a window overlooking the stars, her silver eyes reflecting the distant light of 1,000 suns. You saved my daughter again, she said. How did you know? Her hands were shaking, Ji-hoon replied. 3 months ago, they never shook. Something had changed. Something had frightened her. Yeonsu was silent for a long moment. My previous guardians were weapons, she finally said. Turning to face him, they were swords and shields. Instruments of destruction that I pointed at my enemies. I thought that was what a guardian should be. I thought wrong. She rose and walked toward him. And Ji-hoon saw something in her ancient eyes that he had never seen before. I do not need another weapon, she continued. I have weapons enough. What I need is someone who sees my daughter as a child to protect. Not a political asset to secure. Someone who notices when a servant is frightened. Someone who tells her stories and makes her laugh. She stopped in front of him and placed one slender hand on his shoulder. You are the first guardian in 3,000 years who has done that, she said softly. The first who has seen her as a person rather than a prize. That is why I chose you, Park Ji-hoon. That is why I will keep choosing you. Ji-hoon bowed his head, overwhelmed by the weight of her words. I will not fail her, he said. I swear it. Yeonsu smiled. And for just a moment she looked not like an ancient ruler, but like a mother who had finally found someone she could trust. I know you will not, she said. That is precisely why you are here. Park Ji-hoon drifted in darkness for 3 days. His body lay in the palace medical wing, wrapped in regeneration patches that slowly rebuilt the flesh that had been burned away from his back and shoulders. Machines breathed for him when his lungs forgot how machines kept his heart beating when it tried to stop. And through it all, the doctors marveled that he was alive at all. No human should have survived that discharge. No human should have been able to move afterward, let alone maintain his grip on the child he had been protecting. Yet here he was, broken but breathing, defying every prediction they made about his chances outside the medical wing. The selection had descended into chaos. The other candidates were furious. Vorith, the Kreth champion, had formally protested to the selection council, demanding that the human be officially disqualified for abandoning his position during the trials. He fled like a coward, Vorith declared to anyone who would listen. He saw true warriors and knew he could never compete. So he ran away rather than face honorable defeat. The Sereni Bladen and Sir Seleth agreed, her musical voice carrying a sharp edge of contempt. The selection has rules for a reason, she said. If we allow participants to simply walk away without consequence, we make a mockery of everything this sacred tradition represents. The selection council debated for hours, reviewing footage and testimony, arguing about procedure and precedent. In the end, they reached a unanimous decision. Park Ji-hoon was disqualified from the selection. His name was struck from the official records as far as the trials were concerned. He had never existed. The candidates celebrated their victory over the upstart human, confident that the matriarch would now choose one of them to serve as her guardian. They had no idea that Yansu had stopped caring about their opinions the moment she saw Ji-hoon throw himself in front of that explosion on the fourth day. Yansu visited the medical wing alone. She dismissed the doctors and guards, sending them away with a single gesture, and stood beside Ji-hoon's bed in the quiet darkness. He looked so small lying there, so fragile compared to the warriors who still preened and postured in the arena. Below, his vital signs were weak but stable. The regeneration patches had done their work. A new pink skin was slowly spreading across the wounds on his back. He would carry scars for the rest of his life, but he would live. Yeonsu studied his face for a long time, in 3,000 years. She had seen countless acts of heroism and sacrifice. She had watched warriors die for causes they believed in and generals fall on their swords rather than face defeat, but she had never seen anything quite like what this human had done. He had not calculated the risks. He had not weighed the potential rewards. He had not even known whose child he was saving. He had simply seen a little girl in danger and moved to protect her without a single thought for his own survival. That kind of instinct could not be trained or taught. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere that most beings never touched in their entire lives. Yansu reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from Ji-hoon's forehead. "You foolish, wonderful creature," she whispered. "You have no idea what you have done." The formal selection ceremony was scheduled for the following morning. Every candidate assembled in the great hall, kneeling in perfect rows before the empty throne, where Yansu would pronounce her choice. Vorith knelt at the front, his massive form radiating confidence. 900 battles he had won, 900 enemies he had crushed beneath his fists. Surely the matriarch would see his worth. Seleth knelt nearby, her blade resting across her palms in the traditional pose of offering. Her steel had never missed its target. Her speed was legendary across 7 systems. How could anyone choose differently? The other candidates waited with varying degrees of hope and anxiety, each one believing they had proven themselves worthy. During the trials, none of them noticed that one space in the formation remained empty. None of them thought about the human who should have been. Kneeling there, Yeonsu entered the hall in full ceremonial regalia, her silver robes flowing behind her like liquid metal. She moved with the slow grace of someone who had seen empires rise and fall, her silver eyes sweeping across the assembled warriors. The traditional words of selection were spoken. The ancient rituals were observed, and then Yansu began to walk. She passed Vorath without a glance. She passed Seleth without slowing. She walked past every legendary warrior, every undefeated champion, every master of blade and battle, who had traveled across the stars to compete for the honor of serving her. She stopped in front of the empty space where Park Ji-hoon should have been kneeling. The hall fell absolutely silent. Yansu raised her hand and spoke. The sacred words of selection to the air itself, to the absence where a disqualified human should have stood. "I choose you," she said, her voice ringing through the stunned silence. "Rise and take your place at my side." Vorath surged to his feet, his face twisted with rage. "This is an outrage," he roared. The human was disqualified. He fled the trials like a coward. "You cannot choose someone who is not even here." Yonsu turned to face him, and something in her silver eyes made the massive Kreth warrior take an involuntary step backward. "He did not flee," she said, her voice cold as the void between stars. "He ran toward danger that none of you even noticed. He threw himself in front of an explosion to save my daughter. He did not calculate. He did not hesitate. He simply moved." She looked around the hall at all the legendary warriors who had come to prove their worth. "Any of you could have done what he did," she continued. "Any of you could have noticed a child wandering into danger. Any of you could have chosen to protect her instead of showing off your strength in the arena. But you did not. Only he did." Yansu turned back to the empty space and smiled. "Bring him to me when he wakes," she commanded. "I have made my choice, and I will not be questioned." The hall erupted in protests and arguments, but Yansu ignored them all. She walked out of the ceremony without looking back, leaving chaos and confusion in her wake in the medical wing. Ji-hoon slept on, unaware that his life had just changed forever. He did not know that he had been chosen by the most powerful being in 12 star systems. He did not know that warriors who had trained for centuries now cursed his name with bitter hatred. He only knew, in the deepest part of his unconscious mind, that a little girl was safe, and somehow that was enough. The orbital palace of High Matriarch Yansu hung like a jewel against the endless black of space, its crystalline spires catching the light of 3 distant suns and scattering rainbows across the void for 3,000 years. Yansu had ruled the Volanthi hegemony from this place, watching empires rise and crumble while her people endured through every storm the galaxy could throw at them. She had outlived 6 personal guardians, each one a legendary warrior whose name was still spoken with reverence across 12 star systems. Now she stood on the observation platform above the grand arena, her silver eyes scanning the warriors assembled below, searching for the 7th soul who would stand between her and death itself. The selection had drawn competitors from every corner of known space. Towering Kreth juggernauts stood like living mountains of muscle and bone, their forearms folded across chests that could stop plasma rounds without flinching. Sereni Bladenessers moved through warm-up routines with liquid grace, their movements so fast that ordinary eyes could only see blurs of gleaming metal. Gorvax champions waited in perfect stillness, their bodies encased in biological armor that had evolved over millions of years to withstand any weapon. And then there was the human Park Ji-hoon stood at the edge of the gathered warriors, looking impossibly small and fragile compared to the giants around him. He wore simple combat gear without any of the ornate decorations that marked the other candidates as champions of their respective worlds. His dark hair was cropped short in a practical military cut, and his brown eyes moved constantly, studying everything and everyone around him with quiet intensity. A Kreth warrior named Vorath noticed the human and let out a rumbling laugh that shook the air. "Look at this," Vorath said to his companions, gesturing toward Ji-hoon with one massive arm. "The primitives have sent us a snack." The other warriors joined in the laughter, and Ji-hoon simply stood there, his expression unchanged, as if the mockery was nothing more than background noise. High above them, Matriarch Yeonsu watched this exchange with mild interest. Humans were relatively new to the galactic community, their species having achieved faster-than-light travel only 2 centuries ago. Most of the elder races viewed them as children playing in a universe far too dangerous for their fragile bodies and short lifespans. Yet something about this particular human caught her attention. Though she could not yet say what it was, the trials began with displays of raw strength. Vorath lifted a transport shuttle with his 4 arms, holding it above his head while the crowd roared approval. A Gorvax champion shattered a block of compressed diamond with a single punch. The Serini Bladensers put on a demonstration of combat that left 3 training drones in pieces before anyone could blink. When Ji-hoon took his turn, he performed a simple hand-to-hand combat routine that drew polite silence from the observers. His movements were quick and efficient, but they lacked the overwhelming power that the other candidates had displayed. Several advisors leaned close to Yeonsu and whispered that the human was clearly unworthy of consideration. Yeonsu said nothing, but she noticed how Ji-hoon positioned himself after his demonstration, choosing a spot that gave him clear sight lines to every entrance and exit in the arena. She noticed how his eyes tracked not the other warriors, but the movement of servants and officials around the edges of the space. She noticed, and she remembered young Minna had grown bored at 40 years old. She was barely more than a toddler by Volanti standards, though her physical form resembled a human child of perhaps 6 or 7 years. Her mother had brought her to witness the selection, believing it would be educational for the future leader of the hegemony. But the endless displays of violence and strength held no interest for Minna. She wanted to explore. Her attendants were focused on the trials, their attention captured by a particularly brutal sparring match between 2 Kreth warriors. Minna saw her chance and slipped away, her small feet making no sound on the polished floor as she wandered through a side passage. The restricted section of the palace was supposed to be sealed, but a maintenance door had been left slightly open. Minna squeezed through, delighted by her own cleverness, and found herself in a corridor filled with humming machinery and blinking lights she did not understand. That she was standing next to a primary power conduit. She did not see the warning lights that had begun to flash red. She did not hear the high-pitched whine that indicated a catastrophic discharge was building in the damaged system. But Park Ji-hoon did. He had positioned himself near the edge of the arena specifically because something felt wrong. 20 years of combat experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every instinct he possessed was screaming that danger was close. When he saw the small figure slip through the maintenance door, his heart nearly stopped when he heard the whine of failing power systems. He did not think, he simply moved. The other candidates watched in confusion as the human sprinted away from the arena, abandoning his position in the trials. Vorath laughed again and declared that the primitive had obviously realized he was outmatched and fled in shame. But High Matriarch Yeonsu had seen where Ji-hoon was running. She had seen the look on his face, and she knew with terrible certainty what was about to happen. Ji-hoon burst through the maintenance door and saw Minna standing directly beneath the conduit, looking up at the pretty lights with innocent curiosity. He had maybe 2 seconds before the discharge. Not enough time to reach her and escape. Enough time to reach her. He crossed the distance in 3 desperate strides, wrapped his body around the child, and turned his back to the conduit just as the world turned white. The explosion threw them both across the corridor. Ji-hoon felt fire race across his back. felt his skin burn and his muscles seize as the electricity tore through his nervous system. He held onto Mina with every fragment of strength he possessed, keeping her small body pressed against his chest, using himself as a shield against the destruction raining down around them. When the noise finally stopped, Ji-hoon was lying on his side in a pile of debris. His back was a ruin of burned flesh and melted armor. His heart had stopped beating, but his arms were still locked around Mina, and she was crying but unharmed, protected by the body of a human who had given everything to save a child. He did not know medical teams rushed to the scene and pulled Mina from Ji-hoon's grip. They worked frantically to restart his heart. Once, twice, until finally it began to beat again on its own. Yeon-soo arrived moments later, pushing through the crowd of officials and guards until she reached her daughter. She held Mina close and whispered words of comfort while her silver eyes remained fixed on the broken human being loaded onto a medical stretcher. "He saved me, Mother," Mina said through her tears. "The human saved me." Yeon-soo watched as they carried Ji-hoon away, his body limp and barely alive. And she felt something stir in her ancient heart that she had not felt in centuries. "Yes," she said softly. He did. The trials continued in the arena. Warriors still fighting and displaying their power for an audience that had not yet learned what had happened in the maintenance corridor. But for Yeon-soo, the selection was already over. She had found what she was looking for,